Good morning. My name is Sheridan, and the title of my case study is State Power and the Regulation, excuse me, of Asylum Seekers in Direct Provision. Over the next 10 minutes or so, my argument will be simple. Direct provision isn't a housing policy that is underperforming. It's a mechanism of state control, and the frameworks that we have learned about in this course show us exactly how it works. Here's a brief roadmap of what we'll cover. Context on what direct provision actually is, the theoretical frameworks I'm drawing on for this study, how the frameworks play out in practice, key findings from the literature, and a few open questions and resources to finish. What is direct provision? Introduced in 2000 as a temporary emergency measure. So 26 years on, it's still the primary system. Let that sit with you for a moment. The temporary system that has outlasted how many governments since. Shared rooms with strangers, fixed meal times, curfews, visitor restrictions, no right to work for most of its history, €38 and say 80 cents a week allowance. Now you could hear all that and think that's not ideal, but it's housing. And that would be a fair initial response. But you could also hear that and think it sounds eerily similar to the power dynamics and conditions of a prison. My argument is that it is more of the latter and that it's not adequate housing. It is institutional control. Sociology will tell us precisely what kind. There are five frameworks that we will discuss with regard to direct provision. Goffman's, total institution, enclosed, formally administered life cut off from society. He meant prisons and psychiatric hospitals. The fit here makes for uncomfortable comparisons. Foucault via Hewson, the disciplinary mechanisms aren't incidental to direct provision. They are fundamentally part of it. Ambigen's bare life, residents aren't expelled and aren't citizens. And they are in a permanent legal limbo. Bourdieu's symbolic violence classification as underassessment does a real material damage while looking like a neutral admin. And Gransky explains that the survival temporary does ideological work that keeps the public pressure off. So it's about doing the bare minimum and then being seen to do something that they can then point to, them being the government, and say, oh, look what we're doing, but they're doing nothing really. So let me bring those frameworks down with down to earth with some specifics as it relates to um, direct provision. On the Goffman-Foucault side, the physical architecture of direct provision centres does something particular to daily life. Sign in and sign out procedures, room checks, curfews, the close presence of staff and security in communal spaces. These produce something very close to a Foucauldian panoptician. They're a prison, effectively. You have exactly the same conditions in prisons. If you think about it, room checks, curfews, everything is heavily monitored by people. Um, they may not have their doors locked or barred, but effectively it's the same thing. Residents can't always be certain whether or not they're being observed. Again, this is something that people who are in prison have to endure. They endure it because it's a form of punishment. There's no suggestion that direct provision is a form of punishment, and yet it seems to be something that's in place, maybe as a not to make it so attractive to seek asylum in Ireland. Because they're being observed, they start to regulate their own behaviour accordingly. So effectively, they become institutionalised exactly the same way as a prisoner would. Hewson's 2020 study, one of the most directly relevant pieces of research for this case study, is titled "All the Time Watched," which is a direct quote from a resident. That phrase tells you something, and crucially, Hewson's point is that this observation doesn't exist as it does in Bentham's prison to reform the observed. It exists to maintain administrative order over a population the state hasn't yet decided what to do with. So again, there is no suggestion of any malfeasance on the part of these people, but because we can't decide what to do with them, they're held in this limbo. On the Agamben, Bordeaux side, the suspended status residents occupy is genuinely unusual. They're not expelled. They're not imprisoned. Well, I believe they are in a sense. But they're held in a condition of permanent uncertainty and limbo. And that limbo is a prison of sorts. They're in the jurisdiction, they're subject to its rules, but they have no rights. Agamben's bear-like framework captures that well, and Bourdieu helps us see how the bureaucratic language of international protection applicant and claim processing does ideological work. It makes a form of sustained institutional control appear as administrative neutrality. And we're taking care of you to the people, and we're processing your application to make your life better. And then they can sort of say, point to it and say to the greater public, well, we're taking care of this. And they're doing nothing of the sort, as I said. The theoretical frameworks would be interesting enough on their own, but they're backed by a substantial body of empirical research, and what that research shows is tough reading. Arnold et al. As 2017 study of children that are in direct provision found that growing up in the system is associated with poverty, restricted developmental opportunities, and immeasurably diminished childhood compared to their peers outside. How could it not? Their parents aren't able to function properly, and they're seeing this all the time. They live in one room a lot of the time with their families. They have no space to develop. Children are socialized into an institutional life not dissimilar to prison, and not because of anything that they or their families did, but because of the way the administration chooses to take care of them. And it's the status that their families occupy. Daly and O'Riordan, writing after COVID, document what they call care deficits, substantial gaps between what the state says it provides and what residents actually experience in overcrowded centres during a public health emergency. The mental health picture is particularly significant. Conroy et al. Finding significantly elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and PTSD amongst residents, and how could they not? And these outcomes are linked in the literature not primarily to what people experienced before arriving in Ireland, but to the conditions of prolonged uncertainty and institutional dependency that direct provision creates, the lack of autonomy, the prison-like conditions. That is going to be a recipe for PTSD. Nirala's research on trust adds to social dimension, the repeated experience of being assessed and reassessed by state authorities, combined with dependence on institutional actors and sorry, for basic needs, and it produces a deep and lasting mistrust. Lenton situates all of this within the longer Irish story, a historical pattern of managing inconvenient populations through institutional isolation, workhouses, asylums, mother and baby homes, Magdalen laundries. The pattern, she argues, is the disavowal of populations thus managed. It doesn't matter whether it's the British government, the Catholic Church, or the Irish government, it's all the same. It's all about power. It's all about the most disadvantaged being taken advantage of or just being utterly dismissed. No case study is without its unresolved questions, and I want to be honest about a few. The first is about Agamben, Owen raises a legitimate critique. The Bare Life framework, if taken too far, can deny asylum seekers any agency. I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to just illuminate what the issues are, rather than define the residents. It's not of their making. The second is about reform. Since 2021, there have been some policy changes. The white paper on direct provision and committed to a new model. Whether those changes fundamentally alter the structure remains to be seen, but it's something that they're still working through. And intent versus function. I'm making claims about what direct provision does structurally, not about what any individual civil servant or minister intended. I, I sort of tend to err on the side of never attribute to malice what you can attribute to incompetence, and that's perhaps even a bit harsh. I think what happened was we had never been faced with any meaningful um, numbers of people coming for asylum, but that has changed dramatically in the last 25, 26 years. And that's an important distinction to make. So I want to close by pulling the threads together. On the left, I've flagged the 5 resources I'd most recommend to anyone wanting to go further on this topic. Hewson is probably the most directly relevant. O'Reilly's ethnographic works gives it a human texture, and Loyal and Letton provide the macro-level Irish context, and Goffman remains the foundational text. By conclusion, what I hope this presentation has shown is that direct provision, looked at through a sociological lens, reveals something important about the Irish state and how it exercises power over one particular group, a marginalised group at that, and not through overt coercion, but through institutional structure, disciplinary routine, symbolic classification, and the quiet work of framing a permanent solution as temporary. I do think the parallels between former administrations going back many hundred years are interesting, and the inability to join those dots I find fascinating, that we don't seem to learn despite knowing our history. And that is my presentation. Thank you.